September 22, 1943. Fort Lawton, Washington State. The fork felt heavy in Marco Rossetti's calloused hand as he watched the scene unfolding before him with a mixture of disbelief and something close to shame. Across the vast dining hall, 73 Italian women sat frozen in their chairs, staring at plates piled high with food that seemed to glow under the harsh fluorescent lighting. Roasted chicken with golden skin still crackling, mashed potatoes swimming in butter, green beans glistening with what appeared to be actual bacon fat, and fresh bread so white it looked like it had been bleached by angels. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marco had been captured 3 weeks earlier during the Allied invasion of Sicily, swept up in the chaos that followed Mussolini's fall from power. As a former sergeant in the Italian Army's Administrative Corps, he had spent the last 2 years of the war managing supply lines in North Africa and Sicily, watching rations dwindle to nothing while being told that victory was just around the corner. He had seen men die not from British bullets but from dysentery caused by contaminated water and spoiled meat. He had watched children in Sicilian villages fight over crusts of bread that soldiers had thrown away because they were too moldy even for desperate troops. Now he sat in an American prisoner of war camp, having been assigned as a translator and liaison between the American guards and the newly arrived Italian female prisoners. These weren't ordinary women caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were fascist youth volunteers, communication specialists, nurses who had served in field hospitals, and administrative personnel who had kept Mussolini's war machine running even as it ground itself into dust. Women who had believed with absolute conviction that fascism represented the future of civilization, that Italy would restore the glory of ancient Rome, and that America was a nation of soft, decadent materialists who would crumble at the first sign of real hardship. Marco himself had believed these things once, back when he was young and the speeches made sense and the uniforms looked sharp in the Tuscan sunlight. He had joined the fascist youth at 15, believing every word about Italian superiority and the weakness of democratic societies. He had marched in parades and shouted the slogans and felt his chest swell with pride when Il Duce spoke of empire and destiny. The war had slowly eroded those certainties, replacing them with questions he was afraid to voice even in the privacy of his own thoughts. The women who had arrived at Fort Lawton yesterday represented who he used to be. Their faces still held that fierce certainty, that absolute faith in the righteousness of their cause despite the obvious evidence of total defeat. They had been captured during the final collapse of fascist authority in Italy, pulled from communication bunkers and field hospitals as American forces swept north from Sicily. Many had never fired a weapon or seen direct combat, but they had witnessed something perhaps more devastating, the complete disintegration of the system they had devoted their lives to serving. Among them sat Lucia Ferrero, a 24-year-old communications officer from Turin who had coordinated radio transmissions between Italian units during the North African campaign. Her dark hair was cropped short in military fashion, her face angular from months of inadequate nutrition, her eyes still burning with the defiant pride that fascist ideology had instilled in its most dedicated followers. Marco had been assigned to process her intake paperwork, translating her responses to American questions about her service record and political affiliations. During that interview, Lucia had stated with absolute conviction that she remained loyal to fascist principles despite Italy's military defeat. She had declared that American abundance was built on the exploitation of weaker nations, that democracy was merely disguised tyranny of the wealthy, and that Italian suffering during the war had been noble sacrifice for a higher purpose. Her voice had not wavered even as Marco translated her words to the American officer conducting the interview, even as he felt his own certainty crumbling with each translated phrase. The American officer, a captain named Robert Mitchell from somewhere in Iowa, had simply nodded and made notes without argument or anger. This restraint had surprised Marco more than any heated debate could have. In the Italian army, such defiance from a prisoner would have resulted in immediate punishment. Here, the American officer had simply ensured Lucia was given clean clothes, a medical examination, and directions to the mess hall. The casual professionalism challenged everything Marco had been taught about American disorder and democratic weakness. Also among the prisoners was Julia Marchetti, a nurse from Naples who had served in a field hospital in Libya before being transferred to Sicily just before the Allied invasion. At 31, she was older than most of the other women, her hands showing the wear of years spent tending to wounded soldiers with inadequate supplies and impossible conditions. Marco had spoken with her briefly during processing, learning that she had joined the Fascist Women's Auxiliary not from political conviction but from practical necessity. Her family needed the income, and nursing offered respectable employment for a woman in Mussolini's Italy. Yet even practical Julia had absorbed the propaganda. She had told Marco matter-of-factly that she expected to be executed or at minimum subjected to forced labor as punishment for serving the Axis powers. The idea that she might instead be treated according to Geneva Convention standards seemed to strike her as naive American sentimentality that would surely evaporate once the cameras stopped rolling and the real nature of captivity revealed itself. Her cynicism was born from experience in a system where kindness was always a prelude to exploitation, where generosity served only to establish debt that would be collected with interest. Then there was Sofia Conti, barely 20 years old, who had served as a clerk in a fascist party regional office in Rome before being transferred to military administrative duties in Sicily. Sofia represented the true believers, the young women who had grown up entirely under fascist education, who knew no other system and could imagine no alternative to the authoritarianism that had shaped their entire worldview. She had been part of the fascist youth organization since childhood, had attended rallies where Il Duce promised to make Italy great again, had believed every word about Italian racial superiority and the decadence of democratic nations. Marco saw in Sofia's eyes the reflection of his younger self, and it made him uncomfortable in ways he could not fully articulate. When he had translated her intake interview, she had spoken passionately about her continued faith in fascist ideology despite obvious military defeat. She had insisted that Italy had lost only because of betrayal by weak leaders, not because the system itself was flawed. She had declared that American kindness toward prisoners was merely a propaganda ploy designed to break Italian spirit and force collaboration with the occupiers. These 73 women represented a cross-section of fascist Italy's female auxiliary services. Some were true believers like Sofia. Others were pragmatists like Julia who had served because it provided employment and status. A few were from aristocratic families who had supported fascism to protect their social position. Many were from working-class backgrounds who had seen the fascist party as a path to education and opportunity otherwise denied to women in traditional Italian society. What united them all was the experience of deprivation that had defined the final years of Mussolini's regime. By 1942, the Italian home front had collapsed under the strain of a war the nation could not afford to fight. Food rations had been cut repeatedly until families were surviving on quantities of grain and vegetables insufficient to maintain basic health. The government had requisitioned everything of value, from church bells melted down for weapons to wool coats stripped from civilians for military uniforms. Cities went dark at night not just from blackout requirements but because there was no fuel to generate electricity. The Women's Auxiliary Corps had been promised the same rations as male soldiers, but this promise proved as hollow as most fascist guarantees. In reality, they received whatever remained after the men were fed, which by 1943 meant portions so meager that malnutrition became universal. Their daily allocation consisted of perhaps 300 grams of bread mixed with chestnut flour to stretch the wheat supply, a spoonful of olive oil if they were lucky, and vegetable soup so thin you could see the bottom of the bowl through the broth. Lucia Ferrero had kept a journal throughout her service, hidden in the lining of her uniform jacket. Her entries from the final months before capture revealed the reality behind fascist propaganda about noble sacrifice. July 15, 1943. No meat for 2 months. The bread is more sawdust than flour. Yesterday I fainted during my shift from hunger, but I told my supervisor it was the heat. 3 girls in our unit have stopped menstruating from malnutrition. We tell ourselves this is temporary, that victory will restore abundance. But I think we all know we are lying to each other now. The journey to American captivity had been chaotic and terrifying. Unlike male combat prisoners taken during battle, these women had been captured during the administrative collapse that followed the Allied invasion of Sicily. They had been working in communication centers, field hospitals, and party offices when American forces overran their positions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Many had attempted to flee north toward the Italian mainland, but the breakdown of transportation and communications had left them stranded in a war zone with no clear orders and no way to escape. American forces had rounded them up systematically, processing them through temporary holding facilities before transport to permanent camps. The first shock had come during initial medical examinations. American doctors, including female physicians, which itself was startling to women from a society where medicine was almost exclusively male, had examined each prisoner with thoroughness that revealed the extent of Italian wartime deprivation. The chief medical officer at the processing center in Sicily had filed reports that Marco later saw during his translation duties. These documents described conditions that resembled concentration camp victims more than military personnel. The Italian women averaged 25 pounds below healthy weight. Anemia was universal. Many showed symptoms of pellagra from niacin deficiency, with characteristic skin rashes and digestive problems. Several had early signs of scurvy despite Italy's citrus production, because all fruit had been requisitioned for military use or export. Their teeth were in poor condition from calcium deficiency. Their hair was brittle and thin. Some had stress fractures in their bones from inadequate nutrition during their growth years. The American medical response had been immediate and comprehensive. Each woman received vitamin supplements, antibiotic treatments for infections that had gone untreated, and dental care that many had never received even as civilians in peacetime Italy. They were issued new clothing to replace the threadbare uniforms they had worn for months without replacement. They were given real soap, not the harsh lye substance that passed for cleaning products in wartime Italy. They were provided with sanitary supplies that had been luxuries even before the war. But nothing could have prepared them for the food. Even during processing in Sicily, before transport to permanent camps in America, they had received rations that exceeded anything they had eaten in over a year. These field rations, which American soldiers routinely complained about and sometimes discarded, contained more protein and calories than Italian women's auxiliary members received in 3 days of regular rations. The canned meat was actually recognizable as meat rather than the mysterious processed substances labeled as protein that had been standard Italian military fare. The crackers were not moldy. The chocolate was real chocolate, not the ersatz confection made from carob and beet sugar that had replaced genuine cocoa in Italy since 1941. Julia Marchetti had wept when she opened her first ration pack, not from gratitude but from the overwhelming realization of how completely her government had failed its people. She had spent 2 years nursing soldiers who were dying as much from malnutrition as from wounds, had watched supplies dwindle to nothing while being told that civilian populations were well-fed and content. The abundance in a single American field ration pack proved that every official statement about conditions in Italy had been a calculated lie. The transport to Fort Lawton had provided additional revelations that systematically demolished fascist propaganda about American society. The Italian prisoners traveled not in cargo holds or cattle cars but in troop transport ships with bunks and sanitary facilities. The voyage across the Atlantic took 2 weeks, during which they received 3 meals daily that exceeded the best food most had eaten even before the war. Fresh fruit appeared at every meal. Meat was served in recognizable portions rather than mystery stews. Coffee was real coffee, not the roasted grain substitute that had replaced genuine beans in Italy since 1940. But more shocking than the food was the casual efficiency of American military logistics. The ships that transported prisoners also carried supplies, equipment, and troops in a continuous flow across the Atlantic. The scale of American shipping capacity challenged everything these women had been taught about democratic disorganization and industrial weakness. Single convoys contained more vessels than the entire Italian merchant fleet. The coordination required to move millions of tons of material across an ocean while fighting a global war exceeded anything the fascist government had achieved even in peacetime. During the voyage, Marco had opportunities to observe the Italian women's reactions as their worldview began to crack under the weight of accumulated evidence. Some like Sophia clung desperately to ideological certainty, insisting that American abundance was temporary or stolen from conquered peoples. Others like Julia began to express doubts carefully, testing whether it was safe to voice questions that would have been dangerous in fascist Italy. A few younger women seemed almost relieved to be captured, freed from the burden of maintaining faith in a system that had so obviously failed them. The arrival at Fort Lawton in Washington state had delivered the next systematic blow to fascist ideology. The camp itself exceeded anything these women had known as civilians in peacetime Italy, let alone as military personnel during wartime. Electric lights blazed throughout the facility without restriction or rationing. Hot water flowed from taps in abundance, not the carefully measured portions they had known in Italian barracks. Flush toilets and shower facilities with soap that smelled of lavender rather than harsh chemicals. The barracks were heated against the autumn chill, each woman assigned her own cot with blankets that were actually warm and sheets that were actually clean. Medical facilities at Fort Lawton rivaled major hospitals in Italian cities. Female American military doctors and nurses provided care using medicines and equipment that had never existed in Italian military medical services. The camp infirmary had X-ray machines, modern surgical facilities, and pharmaceutical supplies that seemed limitless. Women who had suffered from untreated conditions for months received care that would have been reserved for high-ranking officers in the Italian system. But the most devastating challenge to their worldview awaited them in the mess hall. Marco had been assigned to escort the first group of Italian women to their initial meal at Fort Lawton, translating instructions and answering questions. He watched their faces as they filed through the serving line, watched belief systems crumble in real time as American kitchen staff served portions that defied everything they thought they knew about wartime scarcity. The serving line itself represented organizational capacity that exceeded Italian civilian restaurants in major cities. Multiple hot food stations, cold food options, beverage dispensers, and dessert selections arranged in a system that could feed hundreds of people in under an hour. The efficiency was devastating proof of American industrial culture applied to basic logistics. This was not propaganda or special treatment designed to impress prisoners. This was simply how Americans fed people, with casual abundance that made Italian military rationing look primitive by comparison. The food itself destroyed the last remnants of propaganda about American weakness and deprivation. Fresh vegetables that were actually fresh, not the wilted produce Italian markets offered even before the war. White bread so soft it seemed impossible, nothing like the dense loaves mixed with chestnut flour that had been standard in Italy for years. Butter that was actually yellow from dairy fat rather than the white margarine that had replaced real butter in Italian rations since 1941. And meat, recognizable pieces of beef, chicken, and pork rather than the mysterious canned substances or the thin soup bones that had been the only protein source for most Italians since 1942. The psychological impact was immediate and visible. Lucia Ferrero had stared at her plate as if it contained evidence of a crime against logic itself. Her training in fascist ideology provided no framework for understanding how the supposedly weak, disorganized Americans could produce such abundance while fighting a war on multiple continents. The cognitive dissonance was written across her face as she struggled to reconcile the physical evidence before her with the beliefs that had structured her entire adult life. Sofia Conti had initially refused to eat, insisting loudly in Italian that this must be propaganda staged for cameras, that surely this could not be real food or real portions. But hunger eventually overcame ideology, and Marco watched her take her first bite of white bread with butter. Her eyes had widened in shock, then filled with tears as she realized that what she was tasting was real, that American prisoners ate better than Italian citizens had eaten even in peacetime, that everything she had believed about American decline and weakness was provably, demonstrably false. Julia Marchetti had eaten mechanically, her face expressionless but her hands trembling slightly as she worked through the largest meal she had consumed in over 2 years. As a nurse, she understood the medical implications of what she was experiencing. These portions contained more calories, protein, vitamins, and minerals than Italian women's auxiliary rations provided in an entire week. The nutritional abundance represented here casually, routinely, as ordinary prisoner feeding exceeded anything the Italian military medical system could achieve for wounded soldiers receiving special dietary care. The dining hall also delivered another shock that undermined fascist racial ideology. The kitchen staff included African American soldiers working efficiently alongside white Americans, operating modern equipment and preparing food of quality that Italian restaurants could not match. The racial integration that fascist propaganda had declared impossible and destructive was functioning smoothly in a military kitchen feeding enemy prisoners. The hierarchies that formed the foundation of fascist belief about racial superiority crumbled with every interaction between American soldiers of different races working together without apparent conflict. More devastating still was the realization that this was not special treatment. Through conversations with guards and observation of American soldiers eating in adjacent dining facilities, the Italian prisoners learned that what they were experiencing was standard military fare. American soldiers ate this quality and quantity of food routinely. They complained about it as monotonous. They sometimes wasted portions because they were not hungry enough to finish everything served. The casual disposal of edible food demonstrated resources so vast that waste meant nothing, abundance so complete that perfection could be discarded without concern. Marco watched all of this unfold with feelings he could not fully process. As a translator and liaison, he occupied a strange position between the Italian prisoners and their American captors. He heard the women's whispered conversations in Italian as they struggled to make sense of what they were experiencing. He translated their questions and complaints to American officers who responded with patience and professionalism that would have been unthinkable in the Italian military hierarchy. He observed the systematic demolition of fascist ideology through the simple mechanism of adequate feeding. His own transformation had begun during the transport across the Atlantic, accelerated through his work at Fort Lawton. Every interaction with American personnel challenged assumptions he had held since joining the fascist youth as a teenager. The Americans were not weak or disorganized. They were not morally corrupt or culturally decadent. They were not suffering from the supposed inevitable collapse of democratic societies. Instead, they demonstrated organizational capacity, industrial strength, and material abundance that made Italian fascist claims of superiority seem not just wrong but tragically absurd. The evening of that first day at Fort Lawton, Marco had been assigned to check on the Italian women's barracks and answer any questions about camp procedures. He found many of them unable to sleep despite obvious exhaustion. Some were weeping quietly. Others were engaged in intense whispered conversations about what they had experienced. A few sat in stunned silence, processing revelations that threatened to shatter their entire understanding of the world. Lucia Ferrero had approached him with questions that were really expressions of existential crisis disguised as logistical concerns. How could the Americans afford such food while fighting a global war? Where did all this abundance come from? Was this temporary or sustainable? Behind each question lay the real inquiry: had everything she believed been a lie? Had she devoted her life to a system built on propaganda and delusion? Had Italian suffering during the war been unnecessary sacrifice for leaders who had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern industrial society? Marco had answered her questions factually, translating information from American personnel about agricultural production, industrial capacity, and logistics systems. But he knew the facts themselves were less important than what they represented. The Americans could afford this abundance because they had built an economy that generated wealth rather than merely redistributing scarcity. They could sustain global war while maintaining civilian prosperity because their industrial base exceeded the combined production of all Axis powers. They could feed prisoners lavishly because they produced so much food that the marginal cost of feeding additional people was negligible. Every answer demolished another piece of fascist ideology. The supposed weakness of democracy was actually organizational strength. The supposed corruption of capitalism was actually productive efficiency. The supposed decadence of American culture was actually social stability built on broadly distributed prosperity. The entire intellectual framework that justified fascism collapsed when confronted with the simple reality of American abundance applied to the mundane task of feeding prisoners of war. The night had been long and restless for everyone in the Italian women's barracks. Marco had heard them moving about, talking in low voices, grappling with transformations that went beyond political belief to challenge their fundamental understanding of what was possible in human society. Some were experiencing something like religious conversion, the sudden realization that everything they had built their lives upon was false. Others were resisting, clinging to ideology even as evidence overwhelmed their capacity to rationalize. A few seemed relieved, as if capture had freed them from the burden of maintaining faith in a system they had privately doubted for years. The next morning would bring another revelation that would accelerate their transformation. Breakfast included fresh milk, real coffee with cream and sugar, eggs cooked to order, and something called orange juice that most Italian women had never tasted. But the true shock, the moment that would define their psychological transformation and prove more devastating to fascist ideology than any military defeat, was yet to come. That afternoon, the American kitchen staff would serve dessert. Not as a special treat or propaganda gesture, but as routine prisoner feeding. Ice cream. Real ice cream made from actual cream and sugar, served in quantities that exceeded what most Italian civilians had consumed in their entire lives. The frozen sweetness would prove more effective at demolishing fascist belief than any political lecture could achieve. The cold cream would melt on tongues that had forgotten such pleasure existed, and with it would melt the certainty that had sustained these women through years of deprivation and defeat. Marco knew this was coming because he had been briefed about camp procedures. He had been told to prepare the Italian prisoners for the experience, to explain that dessert was normal in American dining culture, to reassure them that this was not manipulation or propaganda but simply how Americans lived. But he had no idea how to explain abundance to people who had known only scarcity. He had no vocabulary to translate plenty into a language shaped by decades of fascist rhetoric about noble poverty and virtuous sacrifice. As he walked toward the barracks that morning to escort the women to breakfast, Marco carried within himself the knowledge of what was coming. He knew that by this evening, many of these women would have begun the psychological transformation that he himself was still experiencing. They would taste freedom expressed through flavor. They would experience dignity restored through nutrition. They would witness proof that human societies could create prosperity rather than merely distribute deprivation. The ice cream was waiting. The transformation was inevitable. And Marco Rossetti, former sergeant in Mussolini's army, translator for American forces, witness to the collapse of his own worldview, would watch it happen in real time. He would see fascist certainty melt like frozen cream in the Washington autumn sun, dissolved by the simple power of American abundance casually applied to the care of enemy prisoners. The sweetness they were about to taste would haunt them for the rest of their lives, proof that everything they had sacrificed for had been built on lies. They had believed in fascist promises of glory and empire while their government could not even provide adequate food. They had accepted deprivation as noble sacrifice while their American enemies ate so well they could afford to waste portions. They had maintained faith in Italian superiority while American prisoners lived better than Italian citizens ever had. The brownies and chocolate milk had transformed German women prisoners. The ice cream would transform Italian women prisoners. And Marco would watch it happen, translating not just words but the systematic demolition of ideology through the irrefutable evidence of dessert. The afternoon was approaching. The revelation was inevitable. The transformation had already begun. The afternoon of September 23 arrived with an announcement that rippled through the barracks like electricity through water. Marco had been instructed to inform the Italian women that today's meal would include something special, something uniquely American that they needed to experience to understand. He struggled to find the right Italian words to explain ice cream to women who had never encountered frozen dessert, settling finally on gelato congelato, though even that phrase failed to capture what they were about to witness. The mess hall felt different that day. American kitchen staff moved with purposeful energy, and Marco noticed large freezer units being wheeled into position near the serving line. The regular lunch proceeded normally, the Italian women now somewhat accustomed to portions that still amazed them but no longer triggered the paralyzed shock of their first meal. They ate roasted chicken and vegetables with something approaching routine, though Sophia still whispered prayers of gratitude before each bite and Lucia continued to eat with mechanical precision as if proper behavior might somehow restore the order her world had lost. Then came the moment that would complete their transformation. Staff Sergeant Patricia Coleman from Tennessee began serving from large metal containers packed with dry ice. The vapor arising from the containers created an almost mystical effect, as if the dessert itself was materializing from another dimension. Each Italian woman received a bowl containing 3 generous scoops of different colors: vanilla white as alpine snow, chocolate brown as rich earth, and strawberry pink as summer sunsets none of them had seen in years. Marco watched Julia receive her bowl first, her nurse's hands steady despite the trembling that had started somewhere deep inside her chest. She stared at the frozen substance as if it might evaporate, might prove to be another hallucination brought on by malnutrition and stress. The cold radiated from the bowl in waves that her skin could feel, temperature control so precise it bordered on miraculous for women who had lived without reliable refrigeration for years. The first taste happened in silence. 73 women lifted spoons simultaneously, each one carrying a small portion of impossibility toward mouths that had forgotten such sensations could exist. Julia's spoon held vanilla, and when the frozen cream touched her tongue, her eyes closed involuntarily against the cascade of flavors and memories and realizations that struck with physical force. The sweetness was almost violent after years of deprivation, the cold shocking against tissues accustomed to lukewarm soup and stale bread, the richness overwhelming taste buds that had adjusted to monotony. The cream began melting immediately, coating her mouth with flavors so complex they seemed to contain entire philosophies about abundance and pleasure and human dignity. Real cream from American dairy farms, sugar from Louisiana refineries, vanilla imported from Madagascar even during global war, all combined into something that transcended mere food to become proof of a social system that valued joy for its own sake. This was not nutrition distributed for survival. This was pleasure created because pleasure itself had value. Around the mess hall, similar revelations were unfolding with devastating psychological effect. Sophia had taken chocolate first, and the intensity made her gasp audibly. Her face transformed through a series of expressions that Marco recognized as the visible process of worldview collapse. Confusion gave way to disbelief, disbelief to wonder, wonder to something approaching grief as she realized what had been stolen from her life by the ideology she had served without question. Every molecule of frozen cream was evidence that fascist promises of future glory had been lies told to justify present suffering that served only those in power. Lucia worked through her ice cream with methodical attention, alternating between flavors as if conducting a scientific experiment. Her communications training had taught her systematic analysis, and she was applying those skills to the problem of ice cream the way she might decode an encrypted message. Each spoonful provided new data points that contradicted everything she had believed about American society. The strawberry contained real fruit, not artificial flavoring. The chocolate used genuine cocoa, not ersatz substitutes. The vanilla showed complexity that required quality ingredients and careful preparation. Every bite was proof of agricultural abundance, industrial capacity, and cultural sophistication that made Italian fascist claims about American weakness seem not merely wrong but criminally deceptive. The temperature itself carried meaning that went beyond physical sensation. This ice cream had been kept frozen through mechanical refrigeration, transported in specialized equipment, served at precisely controlled temperatures. The logistics required to deliver frozen dessert to enemy prisoners exceeded what the Italian military could achieve for its own officers. Single American prison camps possessed refrigeration capacity that rivaled entire Italian cities. The casual application of advanced technology to the mundane task of serving dessert demonstrated resources so vast they redefined what was possible in human civilization. Marco noticed one young woman, barely 18, who had begun weeping silently as she ate. Tears ran down her face while she continued methodically consuming her ice cream, unable to stop despite obvious emotional distress. He recognized in her the same crisis he had experienced during his own transformation. She was mourning not just for what she had lost but for what she had never been allowed to have, for the childhood stolen by ideology that declared pleasure suspect and abundance dangerous. Staff Sergeant Coleman moved through the mess hall with additional servings, offering seconds to any prisoner who wanted more. This casual generosity proved as shocking as the initial serving. In Italian military culture, seconds were unthinkable. Food was rationed precisely, distributed according to rank and need, never offered freely based on desire alone. The concept that prisoners could have more dessert simply because they wanted it challenged authoritarian assumptions about resource distribution and social control that had governed their entire lives. Several women accepted second servings with hands that shook for more than cold. The act of choosing to take more, of expressing individual preference rather than accepting assigned portions, represented a small but significant exercise in personal freedom. They were learning democracy through dessert, experiencing autonomy through ice cream, discovering that societies could function without rigid control of every small decision. Julia finished her second bowl and sat staring at the empty dish as if it contained answers to questions she was only beginning to formulate. As a nurse, she understood the medical implications with painful clarity. The calcium in this single dessert exceeded what Italian women's auxiliary members received in a month. The sugar provided energy that Italian soldiers fought entire battles to obtain. The fat content offered calories that Italian civilians would have considered a week's worth of nutrition. And this was served casually, routinely, to enemy prisoners as if abundance was simply the natural state of American society. The transformation accelerated as the women began talking among themselves in rapid Italian. Marco caught fragments of conversations that revealed the psychological revolution underway. They were questioning not just fascist propaganda about America but fundamental assumptions about how societies organized themselves. If Americans could create such abundance while fighting a global war, what did that say about fascist claims that authoritarian efficiency was necessary for national strength? If democratic chaos could produce frozen dessert for prisoners, what did that reveal about authoritarian promises that only rigid control could ensure prosperity? Sophia approached Marco with questions that were really confessions disguised as inquiries. How often did American children eat ice cream? Was this available in stores for ordinary citizens? Could anyone purchase such luxury without special permission or ration cards? Behind each question lay the devastating realization that American children routinely enjoyed what she had never tasted, that ordinary citizens accessed luxuries Italian nobility could not obtain, that the system she had believed superior was actually primitive compared to democratic capitalism's productive capacity. Marco answered honestly, explaining that ice cream shops existed throughout America, that families made it at home with mechanical churns, that children ate it so regularly they sometimes grew bored with it. Each fact landed like a physical blow. The casual nature of American abundance destroyed every justification for fascist austerity. Italian suffering during the war had not been necessary sacrifice for national glory but pointless deprivation caused by a system that could not produce enough to feed its own people while pursuing imperial fantasies. The evening brought additional revelations that completed the transformation. The camp library offered access to Italian-language newspapers and magazines that had been banned under fascist censorship. Reading uncensored accounts of Italian history, political philosophy, and social criticism proved as subversive as any dessert. These women discovered that their own cultural heritage contained traditions of democracy and individual liberty that fascism had suppressed. They learned that many prominent Italian intellectuals had opposed fascism from the beginning, that resistance had existed even at the height of Mussolini's power, that they were not alone in doubting the system they had served. More shocking still were American magazines showing everyday life in cities and towns across the United States. Photographs revealed suburban homes with multiple automobiles, kitchens equipped with electric appliances Italian households had never possessed, children playing with toys that would have been luxury items in Italy, families gathering for meals that exceeded what Italian nobility ate before the war. The casual wealth displayed in advertisements exceeded anything they had imagined possible for ordinary working families. The statistics that accompanied these images proved even more devastating. Single American states produced more food than all of Italy. Individual factories manufactured more goods than entire Italian industrial regions. Universities conducted research with budgets that exceeded Italian military spending. The scale of American achievement made fascist boasts about restoring Roman glory seem not just empty but tragically delusional. That night, as Marco made his final rounds through the barracks, he found most women unable to sleep despite obvious exhaustion. Some were writing letters to families in Italy, trying to explain experiences that seemed impossible to communicate. Others were engaged in intense discussions about what they had learned and what it meant for their futures. A few sat in quiet contemplation, processing transformations that went beyond politics to challenge their fundamental understanding of human possibility. Lucia approached him one final time, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who had spent the day watching her entire worldview collapse. She asked a question that required no translation because Marco had asked it himself weeks earlier. If everything we believed was wrong, what do we believe now? He had no answer except the truth he was still learning himself. Perhaps we believe in what we can taste and see and touch. Perhaps we trust evidence over ideology. Perhaps we build new understanding on facts rather than faith in leaders who lied. The ice cream had done its work. These women would return to Italy carrying within their transformed consciousness the sweetest evidence that everything they had sacrificed for was false. They had tasted democracy and it was delicious. They had experienced abundance and it had proven more powerful than any propaganda. They had learned that free societies could create prosperity that authoritarian systems could only promise and never deliver. Marco understood that he was witnessing history in its most intimate form. Not the grand sweep of battles and treaties, but the quiet revolution that happened one person at a time when long-held certainties dissolved in the face of undeniable truth. These 73 women would return to Italy as witnesses for a different way of organizing human society. They would speak to families and friends about what they had experienced. They would carry in their memories the taste of freedom expressed through frozen cream, the feel of dignity restored through adequate nutrition, the knowledge that kindness from enemies proved more transformative than loyalty to failed ideologies. The transformation was complete. Fascist true believers had become advocates for the very system they had been trained to destroy. And it had happened not through coercion or propaganda, but through the simple experience of being treated as human beings worthy of dessert. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.